For 30 years, a killer lived 2 blocks from a police station in a small Indiana town, and nobody knew his name. He didn't just get away with murder. He came back. Years later, he left notes taunting the same detectives who were still searching for him, promising he'd do it again. And for decades, he was right under their noses the whole time. This is the story of an 8-year-old girl named April Tinsley, the killer who thought he'd never be caught, and the strand of DNA sitting in evidence for 30 years that finally brought him down.
It's April 1st, 1988, Good Friday. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, an 8-year-old girl named April Tinsley is doing what kids all over the neighborhood are doing on a mild spring afternoon, playing outside with her friends. April is a 2nd grader at Fairfield Elementary. She sings in the children's choir at her church. She's got blonde, curly hair and a shy smile that 30 years later, an entire community will still recognize on sight. That afternoon, April and 2 friends are moving between houses, playing the kind of loose, wandering game that kids play when the weather finally turns warm. At some point, April realizes she's left her umbrella behind. She turns back to grab it. She never makes it back to her friends. Someone was watching. A witness would later describe seeing a young girl matching April's description being forced into a blue pickup truck by a white man in his 30s. It happened just 2 blocks from April's own home, the kind of distance a parent wouldn't think twice about a child covering alone.
By that evening, April Tinsley is gone. Her mother, Janet, will later describe those first hours the way every parent in that situation describes them: sitting by a window, replaying the day, trying to will her daughter back through sheer force of thought. Where is she? Who's got her? The search that follows is fast, and it is desperate. But 3 days later, on April 4th, a jogger makes a discovery that ends the search and begins a 30-year nightmare for an entire city. April's body is found in a water-filled ditch in a rural area roughly 20 miles from her home. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Nearby, a chilling detail investigators would sit with for years. One of her shoes is found 1,000 feet from where she lies. It's as if, at some point, she'd been carried or dragged across a distance that no one could explain. Fort Wayne police move immediately. They collect what they can from the scene. Crucially, they recovered DNA evidence from April's clothing. Evidence that in 1988 is almost useless. DNA testing exists, technically, but the databases that could match a stranger's DNA to a name don't exist yet. Not for another decade. Not for 2. So investigators do the only thing they can. They canvass the neighborhood. They chase the description of the blue truck. They interview anyone who might have seen anything. And they come up with nothing. No name, no arrest, no answers. April Tinsley's murder goes cold, but her killer doesn't disappear. He's about to make sure nobody forgets him. Around 1990, roughly 2 years after April's murder, a message appears scrawled in pencil or crayon on a barn door, not far from where her body had been discovered. The message claims responsibility for killing April Tinsley. It promises to kill again. Put yourself in the shoes of the Fort Wayne detectives working this case. You have an unsolved child murder. You have no leads. And now, 2 years later, someone is reaching out from the shadows to remind you he's still out there, and he's not done. For years, the case goes quiet again. Then, in 2004, 16 years after April's murder, more notes surface. This time,
They're left with used condoms attached, taunting the community, and again, threatening future violence against young girls.
Here's the part that should stop you cold. When forensic officers test the condoms left with those 2004 notes, the DNA matches the genetic profile collected from April's body back in 1988. The person taunting the police is the same person who killed April Tinsley. He's not an opportunist copying a famous crime. He's the killer, and he has been living somewhere in or near Fort Wayne, quietly, for 16 years, then reaching out just to prove he still can. Try to imagine what that does to a community. Parents in Fort Wayne aren't just grieving a stranger's tragedy anymore. They're raising their own children under the shadow of someone who has explicitly promised to hurt another little girl, and who has proven, again and again, that he isn't a fantasy. He's real, and he's watching. The Tinsley family refuses to let the case die quietly. In 2005, they hold a press conference at the Allen County Courthouse, appealing directly to the public for any information, any memory, any name that might finally break the case open. Nothing comes of it. Another decade passes. April Tinsley's photograph, that same shy smile, becomes something like a fixture in Fort Wayne. Detectives who worked the original case, years into their retirement, still keep her picture on their desks, still think about her, still wonder. For 30 years, the file doesn't close. It just goes quiet, waiting for a technology that doesn't exist yet. And then, 400 miles away in California, something happens that changes everything. In April of 2018, investigators in California announced the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the man believed to be the Golden State Killer, one of the most notorious unidentified serial offenders in American history. What makes headlines isn't just the arrest, it's how they did it. Investigators had taken DNA collected from decades-old crime scenes and uploaded it to a public genealogy website, the same kind of service ordinary people use to build family trees and find long-lost relatives. Instead of searching for an exact match, they searched for partial matches, people who shared enough DNA with the suspect to be a cousin, an uncle, a sibling. From there, genealogists built out family trees, cross-referenced ages and locations, and narrowed an entire family line down to one man. It was a genuine turning point in criminal investigation, and Fort Wayne police were paying very close attention. Just 2 weeks after DeAngelo's arrest makes national news, Fort Wayne Police Detective Brian Martin arranges to have the DNA from the April Tinsley case sent out for genetic genealogy testing. The lab is Parabon Nanolabs, based in Virginia, the same kind of forensic genealogy work that had just cracked the Golden State Killer case wide open. Leading the genealogy unit is a woman named Cece Moore. Her job is essentially genetic detective work. Take an unknown DNA profile, upload it to public genealogy databases, and look for anyone in the world who shares enough genetic material to be a relative. Then work backward, generation by generation, until the family tree points to one living person. It's slow, it's meticulous, and on July 2nd, 2018, Moore and her team narrow the DNA down, not to one person yet, but to two. A pair of full brothers. Somewhere in that family, one of these two men was the source of the DNA recovered from April's body in 1988 and from the taunting notes left in 2004. Now the case shifts from a lab back into the hands of detectives on the ground. Genetics got them to two names. Old-fashioned police work has to close the gap the rest of the way. Fort Wayne police begin surveillance on one of the brothers, a 59-year-old man named John D. Miller, living in the small town of Grable, just outside Fort Wayne.
Miller has no criminal record. He's not on anyone's radar. He is, by every visible measure, unremarkable. Detectives do something deceptively simple. They pull his trash. For 30 years, investigators had chased partial descriptions, taunting handwriting, and DNA with no name attached. And in that room, the answer arrives, unprompted, from the man himself. When detectives press him to explain what happened, Miller initially says, "I can't." But it doesn't take long before the confession comes in full. According to police, Miller admits that he had already been planning to abduct a child that day, that April simply happened to be the girl he saw walking near her home. He tells them he forced her into his vehicle, brought her back to his trailer, sexually assaulted her, and then strangled her. His own account is that he killed her specifically to stop her from being able to report what happened. He tells them he left her body in the ditch, where she'd be found 3 days later. 30 years of silence, and it takes detectives less than a day to get the full story, once they're finally standing in front of the right man. Miller is arrested that day on preliminary charges of murder, child molesting, and criminal confinement. He's held without bond. When he makes his first court appearance the following Monday, the courtroom is packed, not with strangers, but with April's family. Her aunt, Teresa Tinsley, is there. A childhood friend of April's stands outside in the rain holding a handwritten sign. He got caught. April Marie Tinsley gets justice. Outside the courthouse, a neighbor of Miller's, a man who had lived down the same row of trailers in Graybill for more than a decade, tells a reporter something that lands with real weight in hindsight. He says Miller used to sit out on his porch and talk to the neighborhood kids, compliment them. Just ordinary-sounding conversation at the time. In hindsight, everyone in that neighborhood is left turning over every small, forgettable interaction they ever had with him. Fort Wayne's police chief, Steve Reed, stands before local, state, and federal officials at a news conference and says what the entire city has been feeling for 3 decades. This case has haunted this community for 30 years, for the technology to catch up to it. The case that seemed destined to go unsolved forever had just been cracked. Not by a lucky break, not by a witness finally coming forward, but by a DNA sample that had simply been waiting, patiently, in an evidence room for 30 years, for the technology to catch up to it. With Miller in custody and confessing, the case moves toward resolution far faster than it took to solve. On December 7th, 2018, John Miller stands before an Allen County judge and changes his plea to guilty on charges of murder and child molestation. In his own words, read into the court record, he confirms the abduction, the assault, and the killing, confirming, in a formal legal setting, exactly what he'd told detectives back in July. Allen County prosecutor Karen Richards had a decision to make that not everyone agreed with. Indiana law made the death penalty a legally available option, but given the age of the case, 30 years, and the practical difficulties that come with prosecuting decades-old evidence and long-faded witness memories, Richards ultimately declined to pursue it, opting instead for a negotiated plea agreement. It's a decision reports indicate went against the wishes of at least some of April's family, who felt 30 years of waiting deserved the harshest possible outcome. On December 21st, 2018, Miller is formally sentenced. The agreement calls for 50 years for the murder charge and an additional 30 years for child molestation, served consecutively, 80 years in total. Given his age, it amounts, in practical terms, to a life sentence. His earliest theoretical release date is calculated as July 15th, 2058, a date on which he would be 99 years old. In the courtroom that day, April's photograph is everywhere, printed on T-shirts worn by family members filling the first rows of seats. 3 retired Fort Wayne detectives, men who had carried this case for the better part of their careers, sit together in another row. One of them had kept April's photo on his home desk for years. That Friday, for the first time, he didn't need to anymore. Prosecutor Richards tells reporters afterward that she believes the sentence and the conviction finally gives the community something resembling closure. April's mother, Janet Tinsley, is more measured. 80 years, she says, doesn't feel like nearly enough for what was taken from her family.
Miller was transferred into the Indiana prison system in early 2019. Later reporting confirms he died in custody in 2025, having spent his final years incarcerated for April's murder, meaning the case was never revisited by appeal and never will be. April Tinsley would be in her 40s today. Instead, she's remembered the way this case remembers her, as a shy smile, blonde, curly hair. She never made it home from a game of pretend with her friends. Her case sat unsolved for longer than she was alive. If this is the kind of case that stays with you, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one, where the truth took decades to surface, and where it finally did.